Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today in our 24th edition of our CVC Insider Series. Today, we have a great session ahead with Kevin Crosby from Amazon's Alexa Fund, bringing in some very interesting thoughts into strategy and importance in corporate venturing after a long corporate career. Before I get started, I wanted to just quickly set the stage so that you all have some context. First of all, my name is Omaira, and I am part of 500 Startups. We are the world's most active seed stage investor with over 2,500 direct investments into startups from 75 countries. Within the 500 team, I work closely within the team with corporate investors and investors to build their own innovation initiatives. We started the CVC Insiders Event series as part of our efforts to help raise the bar around corporate venturing and build a more strategic and more stronger, more supportive ecosystem for startups and investors alike. Every 2 weeks, this roundtable features some of the top corporate venturing practitioners and sharing their unique journey into the CVC's specific challenges they face, best practices, and gained along the way. So if you or somebody in your network would like to nominate someone for the series, please do let us know. Our host, Nicolas, will be moderating our discussion, but there is also a Q&A function, so please feel free to ask any questions within the Q&A, and we'll try our best to cover this. So for now that you know what's going on, I'm going to hand over the stage to Nicolas. Please take it away.
Thank you, Mara, and that was a really nice introduction. Very nice to have you doing this first introduction. Thank you, 500 Startups, for this very meaningful initiative. This is really good for everyone to understand what is corporate venturing, what matters, what are the best practices, and how different journeys get us to these best practices and into corporate venturing. Today, I'm really glad to have Kevin, who actually has quite a diversified experience and personal journey into corporate venturing. So Kevin, I look forward to maybe taking 5-10 minutes into your personal journey into corporate venturing and what you learned along the way.
That sounds great. Well, I will start with my background has been working towards venture and startups for quite a long time. I came out of college as an economics major and almost did a PhD, but I decided quickly that I wanted to learn a little bit more around the space of business, especially around finance, and went to an industry around building products and materials. Through that experience, I was part of the innovation teams and learning around how to create new businesses within corporate ventures. And essentially what that led me to is this idea of, well, how do you create entrepreneurship? Where do they actually get capital? What do they do to find business opportunities? And so I decided to go back to business school and major in venture capital and entrepreneurship. And through that time period during my business school, I actually worked with a series of pre-seed to seed stage companies. Some of them were actually recently went IPO'd or acquired, and then other ones did not have the same outcomes. But through that experience, it gave me a lot of opportunities to think about where I wanted to go, how I wanted to support both corporate or entrepreneurship, and think about how my role in venture could be shaped. So I took a plunge taking my internship at Amazon to understand how Amazon builds businesses and had an internship project looking at private label opportunities. And it was a really interesting experience, showed me how fast Amazon does innovation and excited me to come back as a full-time employee. So much so that I've been here now 7 years and have done a lot of really fun things across the journey. And so I started in retail, was part of the team building out the Canada operations team and supporting the buying opportunities. Did that for nearly 2 years. Then I was part of a team growing a new software for internal chat messaging so that our teams could integrate it into the Whole Foods Prime Now in-app chat and things like that. But then through that experience, I actually stayed really close to the Seattle venture capital and startup scene and was able to engage with founders and VCs. And through that journey, actually met the hiring manager of the portfolio side of the team. And that's how I got brought into Alexa's corporate fund, because they realized through my work that I was already doing and my experience with Amazon, I'd be a good fit to join into this role of supporting our portfolio and leading our investments within the Alexa org. So fast forward, that team actually started the Alexa Fund in 2015, and it's at the time was Amazon's first corporate venture vehicle with the idea of growing and investing in startups with voice technology. The goal of that was really to invest in experiences that were state of the art in voice and give them resources to grow their business. Interestingly, along those lines too, we actually saw voice take a major leap forward for our customers, and we continue to look forward to invest in startups that share that enthusiasm of where the voice technology can go. And the fund also does more than just financial support. It actually supports them with tools, resources, and connections to build successful voice companies. And so, if you fast forward now to 2021, we've invested in, over 90 companies to date, with a $200 million venture vehicle, global opportunities as well. So a lot of our portfolio companies that you'll see across the fund are not just US, but also in other locales like the Europe, EMEA, and other locales as well. And interestingly enough, too, if you look at the types of companies that we've invested in, they range from enabling components like microphones, chips, the core AI technology and developer tools that support conversational AI, verticals built on top of that technology. So things like entertainment, smart properties, smart home, as well as new devices that can integrate Alexa's technology like Alexa voice services. And then lastly, some of the frontier technologies where you're seeing other modalities and interfaces that can integrate with Alexa, things like robotics or even gesture and wearables. So pretty broad in terms of the things that we see, but we're very excited to support companies. And then one last point to touch on was through my journey, we actually identified there were a lot of founders and startups that either didn't need at the time or didn't want capital, but still wanted to build with Alexa. And so we actually created a new business development function called the Alexa Startups organization. And Alexa Startups is really built around the experts of voice and AI technologies to help partners work with Amazon for exclusive events, work with executive leaders, deliver thought leadership and technical expertise to our portfolio startups that we work with. It's a non-capital program, so it doesn't require an investment to work with us, but we do provide bespoke operations and engagements with BD, technical support, and access to pan Amazon and potentially investment opportunities with the fund if and when the time makes sense. Startups around our portfolio see us as a partner of choice based off of our team and our ability to support them through the ideation to execution of integrations with Alexa. And we're also experts with startups and VC services that allow other corporate ventures or investors to expand and look at the segment for investment opportunity and grow with Alexa. And right now, our team is the only one at Amazon positioned to have these types of relationships with Alexa startups and the portfolio of companies we work with. And we're actually open for business to do really, really cool work with startups. We're excited to meet with founders and help them through this journey.
Thank you, Kevin. And we will double click for sure about what you do for the startups, how you help them, how you designed it so that you actually make sure that you bring value to them. I think it's very cool that you have multiple programs, some which are about equity and some which are not, because at the end, you really want to help startups and you want them to embrace your technology. Needless to say for the audience, if they haven't done it so already, they should probably switch off their Alexa device because we're going to say the word a lot. You mentioned you did a major in venture capital. I think you're the first one I've interviewed to have done so. So can you talk about this university and the major and what was really cool about this major itself?
Yeah, so I went to Michigan's Ross School of Business from 2012 to 2014. One of the things that I was really attracted to Michigan from other programs was the actual ability to work on venture funds. I was one of the fellows that was on the Wolverine Venture Fund, which was a program. There's actually 3 funds at the university, but this one was really focused on Series A plus venture capital, where students led deals across a myriad of technology interfaces from sensors, SoCs, semiconductors, healthcare, health devices, and consumer technology. And so I was one of the leads for health devices and actually got to lead and participate in follow-on investments for our portfolio companies. And today it's grown AUM pretty substantially, but when I was there, we had 7 million under management and it was an evergreen fund. So that was one. Two, the program around entrepreneurship and venture capital allowed you to actually work with founders and VCs to get experience around that. So during that time, I took a class called Commercializing Ventures, where I worked with a group of startups to launch and drive brand engagement for their products and actually help them raise capital. And so that was another opportunity to be a part of the founder journey through the curriculum. And then over the other side of the investment side, I was part of a couple of courses and also TA for our Center for Private Equity and Venture Capital, and supported our professors in doing research around how investors raise capital, themselves, where they find new GPs from LPs, and then other locales. Specifically, I did some research around Israel and the venture capital ecosystem there. And then the last thing that I would touch on while I was in business school, I actually engaged with Ann Arbor's venture capital investors and founders there, which, with a university around there, there's quite a bit of deep tech research and opportunities to support. And so what I found interesting through that was more direct hands-on experience with founders, investors, how they size and evaluate opportunities, how they think about the needs to invest in specific categories, and what valuations and opportunities make sense from that as well. So through that journey, it was just a really good experience, I think, and has set me up for how I think about venture and founders today.
I'm so glad I asked, because this is really way more applied learning and practice than I expected. And if I had seen this on a resume, I would have thought that's nice. But now I would actually think, wow, okay, someone was actually practice venture capital during the major. Can you share one of the best investments you made during the major and your worst, and what you learned from each of them?
Yeah, the best one I would say was in a ultrasonic health device that actually did cancer detection for breast cancer. And the thing that I found really interesting about that investment was the idea that you could improve outcomes with non-invasive technology. And I think from a customer perspective, that really led, in my mind, thinking about how do you use technology for better customer experiences? What does it mean to be a part of a healthcare device technology company? And how do they think about the approval landscape and actually going to market for those devices? And so it taught me a lot around what a good company is in that space. And then also to think about what a good syndicate looks like. How do they have the right capital to be successful through that journey? And then lastly, how can investors actually support their companies through that journey? And so that was one of them. One of the other ones that I would say was maybe not so great was just hard times on hard companies. If you're in a device space, like they say, hardware is hard. And so sometimes, you have to raise bridge rounds or find other additional, terms and agreements along that process that may make it maybe a less attractive investment, but you still believe in the outcomes. And so had one on that as well. And to me, ultimately the outcome of that was really along the lens of we believe in the vision and mission of where the founders wanted to go. And we thought at the time, doing a bridge round actually made sense to get them to that next milestone so they could raise additional capital. But, it was definitely a learning experience where you find yourself in a position that you may not want to be in as an investor. So.
Very nice, Kevin. So I don't think you know about this, but one of our best investments is also an ultrasound company.
I didn't know that.
Looking to the body, and it's Echo, which is spelled EXO. And
Okay.
this is you're right, this is where we should go. It should be the next stethoscope that every doctors have in their pocket and ready to look. And okay, this is really cool. Now, you mentioned you did an internship in private label, which I think at the time was just starting at Amazon. Can you tell us, why did you decide to do an internship? Why Amazon? And what did that mean for your growth into corporate venturing afterwards?
Sure. So interestingly enough, Amazon does recruit a fair amount of Michigan Ross MBAs. I had every intention to go to a startup or a venture fund during and after MBA, but I think one of the reasons why I decided to do the internship was you don't get many opportunities to take these like large recruiting opportunities and at least explore and experience it. So I at least did my diligence to understand like what companies and spaces would be worth doing an internship in. What attracted me to Amazon at that time were probably three things. One, the ability to innovate at scale. Two, a culture that's pretty long-standing and does some really interesting things. Like we believe in our leadership principles, you live them every day. And the last thing that I really wanted to learn is being part of founding teams before and working with startups was how do you actually execute really, really well? Like how do you build a practice and a culture around delivering results so that you meet your customers' expectations and exceed them. And at the time when I was looking across companies, there's a lot of really great ones, but I kind of checked all the boxes with Amazon. I said, yeah, this makes sense as the right company to learn all of these things. And then depending on where my role would go, I could take those learnings elsewhere. And so I took the plunge. Part of the internship process is retail leadership development. So it's more of like a general management practice. And they place you in teams and categories of where there are internship projects. And mine was in the kitchen category specifically, and really just assessing like what opportunities existed in private label. And I thought, to me, that was a really cool category. I didn't know about it. I didn't learn about it until this point. And what was interesting is through my internship, I had a huge opportunity to learn what was unique about the space, what would be unique that Amazon could offer to customers that would be relative to value for our customers to buy and make sense as a business opportunity. And so that was my 3-month project. I developed the strategy, laid out the execution plan, and brought it just to the point of launch. And then my internship ended and the team took it from there. And so if you actually go buy the white private label dinnerware sets of Amazon Basics, that was my internship project.
Very nice. It's interesting. You were looking to join a startup and you joined one of the biggest company in the world, but it's a company that has a real strong startup mindset. It's like we're just at day one and so on. You talked
That's right.
about the leadership principles. One of them is you are right a lot. But if you think about corporate venturing, you're going to be wrong a lot. So can you talk about specifically about this one, how you reconcile the two, and then maybe more widely, how do you take the leadership principles into what you do in corporate venturing?
Sure. Well, so our right a lot is interesting, right? If you read the verbatim, it's leaders are right a lot. They have strong judgment and good instincts. They seek diverse perspectives and work to disconfirm their beliefs. The interesting thing about that, when you look across our businesses, is when you are trying to make good decisions, we optimize on velocity of decision and quality of decisions. And the thing that I really appreciate is our ability to bring teams in to actually validate and kind of push on the first principles of each of these decisions we make. So to your point on venture investment, what's interesting about that is through our process, we actually seek out the right information to make good decisions with those investments. So we're looking at everything from, do the companies have the ability to attract venture capital? Do they have the right team? Do they have the right vision around where Alexa can grow with their business? From our team's perspectives, we always look for, are there opportunities to help build and support this company with them, and actually make them successful as a portfolio company? And so, we're seeking out those opportunities. But you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, venture is a world where not every outcome is positive. And so through that journey a lot, we reconcile it by, through our portfolio side of the business, trying to support them to the best of our ability and their ability. And so we continuously find opportunities to engage through business development or supporting them through other mechanisms across Amazon to help the companies be successful where we can, even if the company at the end of the day is, either does not continue to be a success or maybe it exits for a different reason.
I think you touch on something I really care about, and this is why I like I write a lot, is because it talks about the value of diverse perspective to invalidate beliefs or assumptions and so maybe you can tell us about how do you embrace diversity and and different perspective, and how do you make sure that, and this is funny coming for Alexa in terms of voice technology, but how do you make sure that every voice is heard and considered?
Yeah. So I'll point to one really interesting experience. So I was one of the leading individuals for our Women Founders Represent program last year. It was our first externally facing diversity, equity, and inclusion program designed to help and support diverse founders and underrepresented founders through their journey and actually help them raise capital. Interestingly, along the lens of finding and building a program to do this at Amazon required seeking diverse opinions and insights for how we should structure that. How do we add value? How do we even, recruit and invest in companies that we find through that program? So diverse perspectives from Amazon, Alexa, devices, all the functional teams that we had to loop in, and ensuring representation of diversity was included. So that was a key thing in making sure that everyone had a stake at the table and just making sure that we actually discuss the right questions, ask the hard questions. And so launching that program actually, taught me a lot about how do we ensure we have diverse opinions, what they look like, and how to disconfirm my own biases and beliefs that I may have to make the right judgment calls. Externally, I think when you work with founders too, you actually see that a lot just based off the math of where founders come from and where capital is deployed. So you actually have to create mechanisms to find founders outside the traditional sourcing opportunities. And I think for us, that comes through building programs like Women Founders Represent. We also built a program with Blavity through Afrotech last year to meet Black founders. And going forward, I think that becomes a big lens of how we support, diversity through investment. And then on the inclusion side of the business, we ensure, again, bringing people into our decision-making processes, but as the founders come through our investment and through our BD lens, helping them think about where they can innovate with Alexa, and then bringing that outcome, the integrations and the experiences to customers. So we're bringing inclusion through diverse founder integrations to customers, and then that outcome becomes the ability to open up new use cases for our diverse customers. And I think to me, that's like the really cool aspect is because our customers are diverse, we actually have to seek out and include that technology in Alexa across our businesses to make the overall business successful.
I will touch on inclusion later because there is a lot I want to learn in terms of process you set up for inclusion. I think it's very relevant that the Alexa product itself and what developers could add could be even more inclusive. But I just want to double click a bit more on the diversity. You talked about your own personal bias, which you realized about. Can you share, and maybe it's personal, but can you share one of these personal bias which through the discussion you realized existed and how you addressed it?
It's a really good question. So, I think one, every person's journey through diversity, equity, and inclusion is unique and different. I think that is one of the first understandings that I had to come to understanding itself. One, beyond that, it was really assessing how I bring people into decisions specifically. So one of my biggest things that I do is I'm very quick, I move fast, I like to own decisions, but sometimes it really requires a lot, slowing down so that you can make the right decisions and bringing people in. And so, my bias there was like, yeah, I can do as much research and diligence on my own, but if I'm not actually bringing people along the decision processes with me, you're probably going to end up both making judgment decisions that are not optimal, but you also run the risk that the people that should be included in the building of these experiences are not owning it with you as well. And so I found that it really makes sense to find a way to disconfirm when I should, move and make decisions myself versus bringing other folks along with me. And then ensuring that the people that are actually in those decisions with me are diverse themselves. Like we cannot ensure they're all the same, backgrounds and experiences and in ensuring that we have diversity at the table itself.
That is a golden nugget. I think you're right that there are many decisions. You can make them fast. There is a sense of urgency in what we do. but knowing which ones actually need more inclusion and more people on the table and more voices, this is not always easy to decide. And I think to be conscious that you need to think about which ones matter, that's a really good insight. Thank you. You talked about underrepresented. When we talk about gender, it's extremely straightforward. When it talks about anything else, it's not always straightforward. How do you define it, or how do you make sure your processes really look at what underrepresented means? And you're a global company too, so.
Sure. Yeah, I think along those lens, one, our process is to ensure we're, again, bringing in the right perspectives. Our team, specifically Alexa Startups, and Alexa Fund requires going across to Amazon, bringing in our affinity groups, our inclusion councils across teams and organization to make sure we're making the right decision. So when we, for example, when we launched the program last year, we did a lot of discussion, and we're learning along the way of what does this mean? How do we ensure that we're communicating to the right individuals, that they're included in this process? Even just the words around that make a difference. And so to us, we kind of set up a process, what I would say, I don't call it stage gate for the sense of stage gate, but you get to a point and you're actually saying, when do we need to actually get validation from the right people that we're including in the words that we do, the sourcing of investments to BD opportunities, individuals that represent diverse groups and where they're underrepresented in capital and investment. And I think, to that mental model, it allows you to see where there are opportunities where we can add more value by building programmatic efforts, as well as seeking out, what I would consider investors that are knowledge experts in the space, or programs externally that are experts in the space to help us along that journey. So for example, last year I mentioned we worked with Allraise, and we also worked with Blavity's Afrotech. Those are experts in the space that we can help find and invest. And then this year we've done support with Women in Voice and a few other organizations that are also supporting underrepresented founders. And so I think our journey through that will continue to evolve, and we'll continue to seek out partners in organizations that can help inform and educate us so that we can actually deliver the right outcomes to founders.
Very nice. And I think you touched a bit on my question I wanted to ask about inclusion process. Maybe let me ask a question which is about consensus. Many people in venture capital will say consensus is a wrong way to go. You actually need to have a strong opinion about what the future could be. Sometimes it could be a contrarian view. And if you can't invest because you need consensus, that doesn't work. Can you explain maybe how you reconcile diversity, inclusion, consensus in a way you make decisions where you invest? Because even if it's not capital, but support, you still have to make choices where you help and where you don't.
Yeah, I think a big function of that for us and myself too. We have a point of view that our customers are diverse, and that in and of itself requires us to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion and consensus in the view of we owe this to our customers. And so, the consensus is around this customer experience that we are trying to build for and make sure that it's optimal for users to actually, work on Amazon.com and actually build products for them to deliver the right experience. And so you see that as the consensus model. Interestingly enough, the journey through that has actually, I think, proven to be true, where when we find founders that may not have come through traditional, locales that venture isn't invested in, we've actually shown that they're building amazing products for customers, and we want to deliver that with them. And so it's actually become a source of innovation for our customers as well. And I think the mental model continues to be true, that more diversity and inclusion is the right consensus for customer outcomes.
Very nice. I want to move to my last question, which is about your personal journey. I think you made it sound very easy, but how did you join the first CVC of Amazon? Did you really work hard to convince them, or did they approach you? How did the fit happen, and what was your journey into that CVC once you were already in Amazon?
Yeah, I think two things specifically stand out to me. One, I had always had a vision that I wanted to work with venture and founders and startups. And so I didn't lose that even while I was at Amazon. Like I always had that as a vision of how do I acquire skills and knowledges that could either help me on the investment side or help me with founders, or even become a GM of a business one day. Like those are the things that I always tried to optimize for. And I think that those skills proved to be true, that when the opportunity came, I had developed the right skill sets and network to be successful in a role. And so when I actually came to that opportunity, it wasn't a light decision for me. Like I had actually spent a lot of time as a builder up until that point, building businesses for Amazon, building programs and technology. And what I had to step away and think about is like, well, what value do I bring in this role for founders or for this team that is unique to what my capabilities are, and how would that help me get to where I want to go? And so I actually did a lot of internal assessment in terms of like, what is the scope of this opportunity for me? What's the impact that I can have? And then what do I learn and accomplish over the time that I'm in a role there? And when I did that assessment, it really stood out as like, there's one, to do a huge opportunity for impacting the category of AI and technology, of where investments can be made. Two, to help build and grow new products and services that just didn't exist. And then the third thing that I really thought about was just proximity to investors and founders that I may not have had when I was not in the space, right? Like I do think like that mental model still was really important. And so that all came true, but I actually still spent a fair amount of time educating and proving to the team, like, why do I think I'm the right person for this role? What value can I bring? And so I did do, some work around, what are things that I would launch or do for the team if I was to join? What would I bring to the table in terms of, programs or ideas that I had, or founders or VCs that I had worked with before that might be applicable. And so all those things kind of came together. And I will say it was not an easy journey in that sense, but like the thing that made it easy is that if you're consistent over time, even if it's 1% every day, you're going to have compounded impact over time. And like, that's the thing that I always try to optimize for, is like, what are the hard things that I want to do 5-10 years out? And how do I start to acquire skills or capabilities that can compound over time, that when that time and opportunity comes for, I'm already set up for success down the road. And so then it also makes it feel less hard than this massive opportunity right when the time comes. And so I would encourage people that are interested in venture or startups in general to think about that. I often get that question of, well, how can I do it? Or can I take a path? And I say, you got to get started. That was actually one of the first pieces of advice that I got 10 years ago, is you just got to get started. You got to seek out opportunities where you add value to founders and to investors, and you're going to calibrate and learn and build that mental muscles that you need to be successful in the space.
I think you have just given me the most cogent guidance I've ever heard about how to get prepared over time, nearly like you prepare for a sport. Really making sure you see the end and you do everything you need to get to that end. I also like the fact you mentioned about try to think about what you would add value when you join. What would be the places you can join? And there's one thing you said, which I really like, the word, being a builder. How valuable do you think it is? Not everyone is a builder. How valuable it is, do you think, for a corporate VCs to recruit in their teams builders?
That's a phenomenal question. I do agree. Not everyone is a builder. Not everyone wants to be a builder. And I don't think everyone has to be a builder. But I do think when you're building teams, you need to evaluate what is the players on the field, so to speak, going back to your sports analogy, or the court, of who do I need to do what types of roles. And from that standpoint, you kind of have to calibrate, one, from a leadership perspective, as you're building a team, what strengths do I have? What opportunities or gaps do I have? And then where do I need to actually bring talent in? So I think the one thing that we do really well is assess that. Two, on the other side, as a candidate, you should evaluate the same way for firms or teams that you want to join. You have to look at it and say, well, I see this opportunity for XYZ firm, and what skills or capabilities do I have? And you kind of alluded to this, interestingly enough, really early in the conversation, which is how do we use leadership principles across
Yes.
Amazon? And a big function of that is that when I look at teams, I'm looking at like, what leadership principles do our individuals on our team do today? What do they exemplify? What are our strengths and what are our opportunities? And then we seek out diverse candidates to include them with these capabilities and leadership principles that build optimal teams. I actually learned this in business school when we did an exercise that actually uses like color-coded team organization. So like you're yellow if you're including people, you're blue if you're more execution, and red if you're more like operational, and green if you're think big. Yeah. And so to me, there was one of those critical opportunities to say, you can never be successful if you're all one type of person or one, leadership principle. You actually have to have this representation across these capabilities. And then you have to make sure that everyone's included through a process to make sure their ideas are heard, that they're bringing their best selves, and that they're delivering their best results. And so to your point on everyone being a builder of companies and things like that, maybe not, but you're a builder in your own trade and your own strengths and leadership principles. And like, that's what we expect you to build on. And then when you come in, you're adding the piece of the pie that was missing, or growing the pie. I don't even like slicing up the pie. It's like, how do you keep growing the pie based off the people that you bring to your team?
I think it's a very good tip. I've used the same, I can't remember the naming of this, but this blue and yellow, red and green. And I remember doing it for the very first time, and I ended up with a square, which means basically all the color exactly the same. And my boss said, no, it's never possible. You cheated. So, but you're right. It's a really good way to know how to compose your team and make sure you don't just have red people that want to go fast and be in action. And you really need to think about this kind of completeness in a way. Really, really good. Now, I want to talk about two more principles. One is dive deep, which I think every self-respecting VCs and CVCs, they have to dive deep. They have to really get to insights that not many people understand. You're making bets on the future. How do you reinforce this every day?
At Amazon, I'd say it manifests in a lot of ways. Like one, leadership actually requires evaluating at all levels. So knowing when to step back and look at the forest from the trees and directionally say, where do we need to go? And if you think about it from that perspective, you probably only have a few of these really high judgment decisions that you need to make per year. And then once you calibrate there, you're able to say, how do I go really deep to ask the right questions that will influence this outcome? So if you took the world of venture investments, there's probably only a handful of questions that you actually really need to know that will make this investment successful. Or at least for the next milestone to raise capital and go from that. And so that's when you start to dive deep and understand landscapes, the industry itself, the team, the product, and even like competitor strengths and customer needs. And you can evaluate, well, where are these key issues that if this company does XYZ, they're going to be successful or may not be successful. So I think you need to be able to step back and then zoom in. And then to that point of zooming back out again is to say, well, which categories should we be making those bets in? Are there systematic things that are going to be beneficial for this company down the road? Are there, areas where, by nature of, capital flowings and industry trends in general, are going to be more susceptible for growth and for opportunities for investments? And so, I think like that's one area. The second thing about dive deep is actually creating mechanisms to do this. And I think we do this really well at Amazon, but like, at the end of the day, you need to have mechanisms to help you scale. Like you cannot, just trust on good outcomes. So if you're working with a founder, like, just saying, here's your capital and walking away is not going to prove them to be successful. You actually have to build the right engagement model to add resources, tools, support to make them successful, and knowing when to dive deep in those areas too, and have those mechanisms to help you audit the business as well. So I think, between building a culture and then establishing mechanisms that'll actually allow you to achieve the outcomes, those are probably the two things that I look at dive deep.
I like the fact you mentioned about zooming back, looking at the big picture, and you really applied it in Amazon, because if I look at your first CVC, and we are going to, maybe it's your opening to talk about something you're really passionate about. Amazon could have done CVCs in so many different topics, so many, yet it decided to focus on voice technology. And many times people say strategy is not about what you decide to do, it's what you decide not to do. So maybe you can tell us about why you're passionate about voice technology, and why was it this topic that started the corporate VC?
So I'll start with the latter question and why corporate VC. When we started Alexa in 2015, it's an interesting journey. I'm sure many of folks have kind of read about how that came, but like the idea was this cool computer with voice technology similar to like a Star Trek computer, and in that sense, it was a really long leap to figure out, well, how would startups and founders build with this technology? And what would they need to be successful in that space? And so when we stepped back at that view, we realized there was an opportunity to invest in companies at the early seed stages to help them catalyze and build with Alexa. And I think that was one of the interesting things of like, why this category versus other categories. It's an area where we could provide a very great deal of support, not just from capital, but from like hands-on support from portfolio side to build these out. And so that was kind of the impetus behind it. The excitement to me is that when you rewind 6 years ago now, it started with an assistant on a smart speaker, and that was enabling cool features like entertainment, music, communications, things like that customers really fell in love with. And smart home was like one of the key things that I think made it really, really cool. Reduce friction to engage your house, turn on the lights, turn up and down the heat, things like that were really fascinating. And as you fast forward over the past few years, Alexa has continued to evolve. The technology continues to get better. The capabilities are adding new features and benefits to customers. And it's moved from just being a voice assistant to this ambient compute layer that allows other types of devices to be built with it, enabling new vehicles to be using it. And for example, like Alexa Auto, modalities of on the go to at home. And then also new verticals that continue to be built on top of it, whether it's fitness or Alexa's health programs, things like that are kind of interesting for these future categories. And then as you skate even further into the future, where you look at the next device classes, the next interfaces, frontier technologies like robotics and gesture, it's really thinking about, well, what is voice and Alexa and AI assistants role in those spaces? And I think as a someone that works with founders, I really enjoy helping shape like, how might we do this? Like, how might we envision a world where voice can be a part of your journey, help you grow your customer segment, make your business more engaging with them, reduce friction, and that's the excitement for me. And so it's much, going back to your point on dive deep, it's zooming out to see that future 5-10 years down the road, and then zooming in at every opportunity and saying, this is where we can add specific value to customers and actually innovate over time that gives us that compounded effect to get to that long-term vision. And so it's super interesting there. And then the last thing I'll point on in voice specifically is if you look at the interfaces from the initial computers to adding a mouse, to adding touch, to adding mobile phones, each layer of interface continues to reduce the friction of customers engaging with compute. And so if you take voice, you can actually imagine a world where more users are able to access this technology. So there's a huge accessibility opportunity here by making it easier to just use your voice. You can speak to it, you can hear, and we offer multimodal use cases with screens, but I think like that voice and audio interface is by far one of the most compelling next generation interfaces for humans to engage with technology.
And for sure, people learn to use voice before they learn about mouse and all of the other abstraction layers. So I like the way you describe it as an ambient compute layer. Now, I think you kind of answered, I mean, your passion comes across very clearly. So I think you kind of answered it, but I still want to ask, because you clearly wanted to go into venture capital. You found your way into Alexa Fund, which is a corporate VC. And then you moved to Alexa Startups, which is no longer about investing in company in exchange of equity and so on. So clearly your passion for the category is obvious, but can you also talk about what was this change? What was difficult about this change, and what got you excited to make that change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the difficult factor, I think, one that I had to think about is stepping away from the venture fund itself, and what that would mean for me as like a growth as an individual, what I would be doing from skill sets and how that would manifest, and the outcomes that I would achieve through it. When I step back and reflect on why and how I made that decision, I think the one thing that really stands out was impact on founders and being able to work with more founders that may not have had support and access. So I was part of the team that really helped shape the initial idea of Alexa startups, and at the time, we were only able to support a greater than a handful, but meaningful amount of portfolio companies. But there were many more startups that either didn't need or didn't want capital at the time, but were unable to work with Alexa in the right capacity that I think we could offer from a BD perspective. And so stepping back and thinking about that, I thought, well, this is an opportunity to help impact customers in a positive way, continue to grow innovation and offer new customer facing features and capabilities. And so that was kind of the catalyst. The growth on it was actually me being able to help shape, where do we think that the biggest opportunity for our support can go? So finding device classes and the new devices that can interact with Alexa was one of the areas that I thought was interesting. Working with the next generation of smart home companies, working with the next generation of smart properties companies and things like that, where I can say that there's a meaningful opportunity where if we put people with founders, we can deliver really cool product and innovation. And that's continued to be true. Like, I think today we're still as excited as we were when we started the team, and we see a big opportunity to keep growing with our founders that we work with.
Very nice. And maybe you could describe the difference beyond the equity part between Alexa Fund and Alexa Startups. And for the entrepreneurs listening in, I'm sure they can address both, and it could be reinforcing each other. And I'm guessing the fact that you know so well both teams could also be one of these nice glue between the teams. So can you tell about how this actually compound?
Yeah. So think about the separate ways that we work together. Alexa Startups is really an expert, I would say, across engaging startups and VCs across the venture life cycle, from pre-seed to late stage growth equity. And a big function of what we're doing is kind of looking at where first in kind use cases are and how do we integrate with Alexa, and often looking at what are the hard to integrate opportunities, because while there's hardened technologies for smart home and thermostats and light bulbs, often, working with startups is really defining where that future can go. And so our team is really positioned for a lot of those deep relationships with startups and VCs, pan Amazon, and helping bring access of our support models across teams, whether they're trying to go to market on Amazon.com, or if they're trying to, get support on AWS. We're actually a really strong conduit in addition to the technical support and resources that we have. Importantly, to your point, though, we have really good calibration of like where the fund might want to be investing in based off of their previous track record and kind of categories that they're interested in. And so when and if the time makes sense, like we do offer opportunities for potential investment and introductions to the fund, and then the fund will take their own processes in parallel, and they're not required like to do one or the other. And so that's kind of the way to separate, is like if and when the founders are ready and the investment fund is interested and wants to pursue it, that makes sense. And otherwise, we continue working with the founders. On the fund side, it's a little bit different in the sense that the goal is really, state of the art voice technology, like a little bit probably further beyond where sometimes startups can actually work with our BD team, and that may manifest itself in a variety of ways. But the key difference and distinction is the fund does provide equity investment, financial investment for the companies that they work with. And the output of that is pretty hands-on portfolio support. And so while BD can scale and support a lot of companies, the founders that are through the fund get a handful of managed portfolio development managers to work with them and kind of bridge the gap and bring them support that may not be as scalable through just Alexa and Pan Amazon, but they look really deep into opportunities that are bespoke even deeper to the companies. So those are kind of the two distinctions. I will say, the majority of companies that I work with, at times they may be interested in capital, but they don't really need to seek it out. And so, I can also bridge the gap there with other investor opportunities as well that might make a good fit. So,
very nice. I want to spend the last 10 minutes on two topics. One is the decision making and how it's different between Alexa Found and Alexa Startups, and maybe what's similar. And then one of your last principle, which is about delivering results, which is always very hard to tell when it's about corporate VC, strategic, and so on. So let's start with decision making. Can you describe the decision making at Alexa Found, at Alexa Startups, and what was different and for good reasons, and what was the same for good reasons?
Sure. So decision making on Alexa Startups, we really frame it around first-in-kind use cases and 3 outcomes that we try to optimize for. Outcomes there around what are the new and novel integrations that we can work with, and then 2, how do we accelerate new opportunities and new categories that might be interesting for startups, and the last one is building founder trust. And I think like those areas are allowing us to frame when and how we work with founders. And a big part of that, again, going back to one of our earlier conversations, is how do we bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into our portfolio of companies that we work with and support to create these new use cases. And so across that's our core decision-making framework of how we select and work with founders. And we run that through a process of how accessible is the technology today, where might we want to go, and how do we help influence the future categories. On the investment side, it's slightly different because they are putting capital to work, right? So they have to do their traditional what I would consider investment processes of due diligence around financials and legal and all of those things that are required for investments. And so they're just distinctly different in those regards. But I think ultimately the outcomes, to your point, reflect kind of the goals and objectives that we're trying to achieve. And so we measure them slightly different. When we look at outcomes for us, things that we look at are new integrations with the companies and delivering results to our customers around Alexa. Whereas for the fund, you'd shape it around like investment outcomes potentially as well.
So if you were to define or to explain the true north KPI, you probably have many KPIs, but you have always one that's more important. That's the one we call true north. What would be the true north KPI for Alexa Found and for Alexa Startups?
So for the startups team, definitely looking at new interesting use cases that we launch. I think that when I look at that, we're always trying to push on really cool, compelling outcomes that are visible to customers. Like if a customer can't touch and feel it, we probably didn't do enough of our work. Like that's my mental model. On the fund, I would say it's probably a little bit more visionary of like where they can go. I mean, if you look at the track record of the investments, they're broad and very big impact. And the cool part about that is like it helps shape visions and categories with the founder. So like we actually take fewer select use cases and go really deep on where they might go. And they open up even bigger categories potentially and things like that. And so, it's a little bit less of the direct integration, but more shaping like where things are interesting for our partners.
It's very interesting. I'm starting to have this visual model where Alexa Found is about going deep and Alexa Startups is about going wide. Very nice. And the last one I really want to deep dive, not just trying to play with words, but is delivering results. How do you really measure delivering results? And how do you compare what you had expected to deliver versus tracking it that you did deliver on expectation or differently?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's aptly timed in terms of like how we do our planning processes and things like that. But a big part of that is setting the right goals. I'm a big believer in smart goals that are measurable, attainable, but also really setting really strong reach opportunities, and then tracking against it. I mean, we definitely use mechanisms, kind of talked about this earlier, but you need those mechanisms to drive accountability and making sure that people will actually deliver results. Now, the harder thing, I think, what you're pointing to is like, well, how do you know which is the right goal?
Yes.
And so, like, a big function of that to me is starting with that North Star vision of where you want to go. And sometimes that one's not as tangible in some regards. So you actually have to make sure that's really crisp and clear so that you can put goals around it. And then you layer on your 3 to 5 year plans and your annual plans, and you're building goals and strategies against those plans so that you execute against it. And sometimes in my mind, I'd rather slightly miss a goal that's right than make a goal that's wrong. And so you have to constantly calibrate, like, is this the right goal? Do you cancel the goal and pick a different goal? Do you actually choose something that makes it a little bit more impactful for your business? And then from there, you can always, recalibrate and keep moving fast. But you should, you have to audit those goals that you have and make sure that you're not skating towards the right direction. One of my old managers that I worked with pre Amazon, I always really liked his approach, where he's like, if you're sailing a ship, ideally you have a pretty broad way of where you're going, but if you're going in the wrong direction, that's not going to help you go anywhere, even if you're like going fast and nimble. And so he's like, he'd rather have a broad area of where we're trying to go and then like recalibrate over time than trying to have a really fixed path and then realize you're off direction, too far down the path. So
it's very nice. I think you made reference to the SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. I actually don't like the A for attainable. I like the A for ambitious. And I think R should be relevant, which I think is exactly what you're describing. If the direction is right, even if you don't achieve everything, that's already better than going into the completely wrong direction. So I want to take maybe the last 3-4 minutes just to talk about what's next for voice technology and where would you like to see entrepreneurs, startups, and also partners, so VCs and CVCs, to come to you, and what for?
That's one of my favorite questions around what's next. I think for where we're going, we're always looking for the next generation devices that are applicable with voice technology and seeing how this ambient compute layer makes it easier and better and different for customers, reducing friction and making it more engaging. Interestingly enough, like categories like on the go, I think are super fun and like really interesting. Products like the Echo Buds that just recently launched their next generation product. Or Echo Frames that launched some new ones as well. And like, to me, it's a new category of where you can bring your assistant wherever you're going, whether you're at home or at work, and it's actually really interesting. I'm really excited about kind of the next generation semiconductors too. If you look at some of the portfolio companies that I worked with, Sentient and Xfinity and Vesper, bringing edge compute, making it better for customers for battery power and capabilities, more robust devices, things like that. And then there's just a myriad of new applications coming in terms of verticals, I think, that are unique and different, from like health to education and areas where entertainment and engagement can be really unique and different with voice technology. But the ones that I think are probably the most impactful are like, how do you open up new customer segments again that didn't have access to it? So if you look at one of the Alexa Fund portfolio companies, VoiceIt, they recently announced accessibility to a capability for people that have non-standard speech to be able to access voice technology. And what's super cool about that is, these customers now have the same technology that many people would have had before, but couldn't because they weren't able to use voice technology. And so we're consistently thinking about like those are areas. I'm really excited. So I have a young son, and I'm excited to see how he grows with this type of technology, and over time is able to engage with it and use it. And so those are the next generation. And I think each generation brings new nuances of how and where they'll use this. But when you're growing up with this technology, it really shapes where the world will go. So super excited about that. And then last one too, plug around sustainability and like making sure that the climate initiatives are taking the right path. And I think there's a big opportunity for voice and AI to be able to shape that as well. making it easier and better for customers to have sustainable products and ensuring that they're, engaging in the right ways. So yeah, excited about a lot of things.
This is really cool.
Yeah, I'll say one last thing too. You mentioned partners. Partners can engage with us in a variety of ways. Like we regularly, like I'm always excited to meet with founders. Anytime that they want to come chat around, how might we integrate with and around Alexa, like happy to chat around that aspect. And then if it makes sense to work with them, always excited to. And then for investors, takes the lens of working around educating how we work with investors, what we can do with Alexa today, where we could go, where they should be thinking about investment opportunities, and then ultimately if they are looking for founders that are building cool things with voice, we're always happy to make introductions and support those types of engagements as well. And so we regularly convene investors and founders together to have talks around where this category is going.
That's very nice. And that's also about adding value to all your partners and people you invest in. So it's really good. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate it. This was a great hour with you. And I think we learned a lot about what you're doing, why you're excited about voice technology, but also how to engage with you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting all of you as well. Thank you.
No, it was really great. Thank you.